I'm with Rachel Fulton Brown, professor of history and medieval studies in University of Chicago. Did I get that correct?
History and fundamentals. And medieval studies is a major that we have, but it's not a department.
Oh, I see. Yeah. We just got out of a lecture of yours, a presentation, where, in one respect, you were an apologist for the Spanish Inquisition, which is something that nobody expected.
Was it comfortable?
You just poked us with the soft cushions. But that aside, that kind of controversy, that alone would stimulate controversy, but that's not what you're known for. You're known recently, of the last 2.5 years, for a very small blog post that you made, which was entitled 3 Cheers for White Men. Could you explain why that was so controversial?
So I made the post in June 2015, and I was in the middle of writing the book that I just published a few years ago. And so it was sort of an occasional post. And what I'd been reflecting on in my time in the academy over the last 30 years or so was how ungrateful people have become for the support that the tradition gives, particularly women, right? And my 3 cheers for white men, one, it was to say European, because we have the sort of phrase of no more dead white men. You know, we've heard enough from those white men. And I'm like, well, 3 cheers for them, right? Because there are certain traditions and values that we have from within the Western tradition that are very good for women. And all 3 of my cheers are, in fact, sort of pro-women. The first being chivalry, and I was phrasing it, you know, in a kind of controversial way, saying, you know, in the 12th century, poets and theologians decided it was a better idea for men to be courteous and chivalrous towards women than to rape them. This was apparently considered controversial by some of my medievalist colleagues. My second point was marriage constituted by consent of both the man and the woman saying I do, which is another theologically a 12th century development, that it's anchored in the sacrament. The idea of sacrament relies on the consent of both the man and the woman, so that we say I do in the marriage ceremony is specifically championing the woman's right to stand up to her family, for example, saying, you know, you should marry so-and-so. And that, I mean, it's like the whole premise of Romeo and Juliet is that they can get married, right? That they have the ability to get married from within the church because they can, at odds with their own families, say I do. And the third cheer was for women's right to vote, which obviously we would not have if some white men hadn't voted for it, right? So I said those 3 cheers, and nothing happened for like 6 months because my blog didn't have that wide a readership at the time, until a colleague in medieval studies, Dorothy Kim, who was then at the university, at Vassar College, right, not the university, she's at Brandeis now, found it and posted in a Facebook group on how she had found an example of white supremacist anti-feminism. I can't remember exactly the word she used.
I can only imagine what words she used to Google and to find that blog post. It had to have been white men.
Yes, probably. White medieval, right, would have probably gotten it. I did a post on my blog after this played out several times of what I called Why Dorothy Kim Hates Me, where I showed the screenshots I had of the names that she'd been using to talk about me from that first response to 3 Cheers for White Men. I tried back in, this was January 2016, to respond within the Facebook group to saying, well, what I meant by chivalry, obviously, they're saying just because there's chivalry doesn't mean, you know, men don't rape women. And I'm like, I never said that. What I meant was we think it's a bad thing. There's nothing in our culture, except for maybe modern Hollywood and maybe the Game of Thrones, that celebrates rape, right? It's in fact held to be a terrible, terrible crime. And in the midst of that, I did a series of posts answering the question what chivalry meant to me, going from Tocqueville, who described American women in the 1830s as, you know, being very public and being very confident going out in public because the men took rape as a crime so seriously, going back through, you know, the difference between Vikings and Crusaders, right? Vikings are famous for being raping, pillaging thugs and selling people into slavery. The Crusaders may have killed people, but they took vows not to rape the women. And there's good scholarship that my colleague Andrew Holt has done on showing that we have no evidence of the Crusaders, in fact, using rape as a weapon in their campaigns. And indeed, they considered that, you know, they didn't do it, right? I made that argument. I thought from within my naivete, that would be sufficient to prove that I had not said what Professor Kim was claiming I was for the reasons that she thought I was, that it didn't work.
Of course, white men, and just even using the word white, has become synonymous with Western culture. And of course, your detractors, when they say white men, and probably even for the reason you used it,
Yes.
was to say that this is Western culture. But you're using their words. Western culture is equated with white men. So have you come out recently, or since all these detractors, and basically identified the fact that, look, this has nothing to do about race. Doesn't even have anything to do with men. It has something to do with Western society, Western values, Western culture. And as a Catholic yourself, Christian culture,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So that's your response to all these people, is that this is a good culture.
It's never had anything to do with race. And of course they would say, but you use that phrase white men and you cheered for them. And I said, well, but as you're saying, I was pushing back against the caricature. You're saying all white, we can dispense with all these white men. And I'm like, well, if you dispense with them, you dispense with some of the ways in which they've actually supported women for thousand years in the culture.
Meaning, of course, a Western society is the way it is, not because of the color of the skin, which was incidental
Right.
to all of the discoveries and inventions and thought that went into building Western society. But these people don't see that.
Because so I teach a course. I taught a course for many years that I hadn't taught recently on travelers, medieval travelers, and I'm teaching it again now, which, saying, look, I have thought about this before. Understanding the way in which Western Christians talked about themselves. We just finished talking about the Crusades, and I was getting the students to look at the way in which even with the First Crusade, Urban makes the call for them to come to the defense of other Christians. And it's like there's literally nothing about what color anybody is. They don't care. What they care is they're being asked to go to the defense of Christians. The Saracens even in the Middle Ages, they tend to be described as great warriors, right? Chivalric in their own terms. Saladin has a more sort of positive image in Western Crusader literature than he does in Arabic Muslim historical sources, because he's not as central a figure in Arab historiography until the 20th century as he is in Christian stories, right? The Christian knights typically recognized even the Muslim warriors as honorable and virtuous, and there's a good literature in the West of using the Muslims' own piety as a rebuke to the Christians. It's like, look, they keep to their law, they keep to their worship. You all have this easier law through Christ, and you can't even do it. So there's absence of all of the categories that my colleagues in the field want to say are indictments of Western civilization, and things that people didn't even think of in those terms. They thought of themselves as Christian.
Okay. So what do you say to the opposition now, the people who are opposing you for actually saying that Western society or Western culture is something to value? What, perhaps in a bullet point form, what are your attack? You're a fencer. How do you repost your opponents?
Well, with faith, right? And the bullet point is Galatians 3:28. In Christ Jesus, there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female. That the categories of race, class, and gender are explicitly rejected through baptism, right? So that there's no racial difference. The race of the seed of Abraham, that you're born a Jew or that you're Greek by ethnicity, makes no difference in baptism. That you are a slave or a free man, social class is irrelevant in baptism. Neither male nor female. The reason that the Western tradition has such a great emphasis on gender equality is because within Christianity, women are considered made in the image and likeness just as the men are, and in baptism there is neither male nor female. You're all souls brought into the church. So my bullet point is Galatians 3:28, which is the direct answer to the exact categories that are being used to critique the West typically.
Yeah. Last night we attended a presentation of yours as well, and you were saying that you go onto campus knowing that there's a lot of people opposed to you, but you go onto campus with a sense of joy. Mm-hmm. And Bob and I have talked about this, that humor, I don't think we've ever used the word joy before, but at least humor is the way, and perhaps the best way, ridicule and humor, to put your opponents in their place. And that's perhaps why they're attacking all the comedians.
Oh, yes.
So when you go on campus and you have this sense of joy, if not humor, is there any way for them to attack that? It seems to me like that's insurmountable. You can't attack joy.
You can't attack joy. I'd say joy, humor with joy is more important than just humor, because humor can be quite vicious, right? And you know, satire can go in a number of different directions. So you do have to be making the jokes from a position of love, I think, ultimately.
Or good-natured.
Good-natured, yes. And you know, that there are certain techniques that I would use, say the fencing techniques, to say if they call you a name, you know, it's like with the deplorables when Hillary Clinton called the Trump voters deplorables, and they all made T-shirts.
They take ownership of it. Yes.
You just own it, right? It's like, yes, and I mean, it's a good Protestant tradition. Protestant used to be an insult too, right? And they say, oh, absolutely, we're the Protestants. That you.
That's where the word comes from, protest.
Right, but it wasn't initially a term of praise. That there's a way of, I used in my talk that I just gave now, this image of the Kung Fu Panda, accepting the sort of attempt by the muskox warrior to steal his life, right? Steal his chi, his life energy. And instead of defending himself, instead of sort of clenching up and trying to grasp onto what he has, he's like, sure, take it, right? And that willingness to be in the exchange, to do it with joy, to say, I'm not going to respond with the kind of possessiveness or hate or anger that you're throwing at me, but I will respond to you with love and trying to give you back in a better form. I try to model that. Obviously, it takes a lot of practice and prayer, and at home I'm not always as calm, but it does seem to give me, in the encounters I've had on campus, the opportunity. People come up to me and they're like, they're going to be all confrontational, right? And I'm just like, I'm happy to talk to you. They back down a little bit, and we are able to talk through the thing that was making them anxious.
Well, I'm glad to see that the opposition against you haven't taken it personally.
How could I?
We wish you well.
Thank you.
3 cheers for Rachel Fulton Brown.
Thank you.